Well, welcome back. Just to add that to Joe's welcome. This is a bit of personal history, really. I arrived in Washington, D.C. to teach at the Washington Alexandria Architecture Center in 1989. I had been to the States once before, to New York on holiday, and that was it. And my mother was terrified. I was 29, but my mother was still terrified at the thought of me living in America. And that was just to do with media at the time. But it was my first experience of one international education for real. And it was a really extraordinary experience, which I hope we'll share, but Susan will tell you most about that, I think. But it's that sense of arriving somewhere I wasn't tenured. I was an hourly paid lecturer that had been asked to bring out a group of about 12 graduate students to this center, which was, as I saw it, a group of different universities, some in the US and some international. In that experience, I shared both teaching students from across the globe, but also looking after, pastorally in a way, the 12 graduate students I had. Interestingly, I've just been to visit one of them in San Francisco who was English but fell in love with Americans and America and became an incredibly successful architect. I'm about to go and visit another one of my students from that period who was American and who I met and was the thesis advisor for two of his projects, undergraduate and graduate. But it was that sense of both community that gave me the confidence, one, to teach, but also to learn an awful lot about the kind of international experience. Not the thing you read on the packet, but the doing of something. And joined something which became very close to my heart. I came here, I think, 5 times at my last recollection, from 1989 to 1999, which was my last visit, or 1998 was my last visit. And every time I taught international students, met new faculty, had shared new ideas, and learnt more about the United States, as different states, as almost like different countries in themselves. So we do have a history, and Susan, I think you joined, if I'm right, and you can carry on this story. I think you joined just after me, and so was there for my second visit, but not for my first. So it was an extraordinary place. It built its own centre, which some of you, I think, will go and see this afternoon. And that in itself was that you could affect the building as well as architects, as well as affect the academic environment, was a really special experience. So that's my experience as a foreigner. But I'm going to ask Susan to just tell us about those founding principles from the official perspective and history.
Yeah, so happy to be here, and I love nothing so much than to talk about the WAAC, so I'm really happy to do this. So the WAAC, this is an interesting story of formal intentionality and sort of informal evolution and development and change. And anybody in the room knows that in large institutions there's the formal structure, and then there's a host of informal structures and relationships and networks that is how things really get done. So the WAAC was founded with a very intentional and specific mission, which was to give architecture students at the School of Architecture in Virginia Tech an urban experience. So the campus is in Blacksburg, 4.5 hours drive or a 5-hour train ride away from here in a rural environment. And the dean at the time, a really visionary dean, Charles Steger, decided that it was really important to support an urban experience. It's where students would make contact with their future employers, their professional peers. And so the WAAC was launched in rental space above a drugstore in Old Town Alexandria. Alexandria, if those of you who are going to come with us today, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the U.S. It was founded before Washington was laid out. It was founded when we were still a colony, and it's really a fascinating lesson in architecture and urbanism. And so it was founded to do that, and it had a very specific mission underneath that umbrella, which was to use the city as a classroom and a laboratory. So in a sense, taking the model of the university where we have classrooms and laboratories and turning it inside out and saying the city is now your classroom and your laboratory. And so it was started as a study away program for students in Virginia Tech in their 4th or 5th year, because we have a 5-year professional architecture undergraduate program. And it evolved to include students whose other universities, Florida A&M was one of them, Cornell, were trying to start Washington centers of their own. And so there was a very informal attempt to sort of, well, why don't you just share space with us? And so that gradually evolved into what we call the consortium. And so I joined Virginia Tech when the state of Virginia gave the WAAC permission to be a degree-granting campus, and that was a big step. And so from then on, we could grant a Master of Architecture, a Master of Science in Architecture, and now, about 15 years ago, a PhD. So we've evolved into a full-blown graduate program, but we are still a study-away venue, and I think we still have the spirit of that adventure of what study-away is when you sort of go abroad or you go study away somewhere, that sense of, here we are, we're all together, this gang of people on this adventure to be in a new place and to learn from each other. And that culture is really crucial, I think, to the community of the WAAC. And so even our graduate students, I think, feel that. So it evolved into what we called the consortium. And that sort of that's how I met Anne. And at one time, we have had members, and I sort of enjoyed hearing Joe list the members of the conference because I thought, yep, one of them. Bauhaus University in Weimar, Oxford Brookes, which was then Oxford Poly, Estonia, UNAM in Mexico City, Querétaro, Monterrey Tech, UDD in Santiago, Chile, University of Mendoza in Argentina, USFQ in Ecuador, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Miami of Ohio, Texas A&M, Florida A&M, LSU, MSU, and of course our own Virginia Tech students. And those were just from memory, the ones that I think that I remember. And so in that sense, that's why we use the term study away and not study abroad, because we're including our own students and also domestic students, which is sort of interesting. And so we sort of, shall I go into logistics quickly? Yeah. So how did this work? Eventually how it worked was there was a fee plus faculty model that was sort of ratio tuned. So if Anne brought a half dozen students from Oxford Brookes, the fee would be one thing and she would be with us for a semester. If Cal Poly faculty brought 12 to 15 students, the fee would be less per student. And so there was a model that we would typically have 3 to 4, usually at least 3 faculty from one of the schools with us. Fantastic experience for us as faculty and for me as a junior faculty member to get fresh, brand new colleagues every year that I had to learn how to get along with, and that we kind of immediately had to find where we related. We all taught studio in teams, which was fantastic. So that model, which was kind of a fee per student plus faculty, and then if it was a school that never sent faculty, some of the schools didn't have the capacity to do that, then the fee was higher. Each school could determine how they were going to pay their fee. So that was also important, is to leave it up to the school to figure out what worked for them, whether they told students, you pay when you get there, or you pay us as part of a global office travel, and then we will take care of it. So, and remember, I was just a junior faculty member at the time, so I wasn't involved in any of this, but I have since, now that I'm a director, seen what were the flaws of that system and what we've tried to correct and what we've actually lost and gained over the years. There was no application. If a school attested that those students were in good standing at their program, they were welcome to come. We didn't put any other gate up to sort of decide. And they also attested to the students' English skills, language skills. We didn't test them ourselves. We didn't evaluate TOEFL scores. And so there was a lot of trust in the relationship. It relied, we call ourselves a very high-touch program, and that high touch began with this. We had to trust our international partners. And so that was sort of a really fascinating experience. And it had some interesting, so if you accept all of those premises, which are the values, how it actually plays out can be a little bit different.
Yeah. I think that was, one of the really challenging things, I think, in it was learning that there were many different cultures. We were all teaching the same subject, but when you actually stand back, there were people who thought technology and making were important. There were people who thought theory was all there was and ideas were all there was. So there was a really different structure. And one of the challenges for an architecture program, but any professional program, is it has a fixed syllabus in its own country attributed to the subject. And one of the things that was a big clash, not in a negative way really, because the centre had its own environment, but was returning with projects where the assessment in the place had to be trusted and where the professional qualifications didn't align. So there were lots of quite fraught moments in doing this. And because I came, I think, 5 times over that period, I saw that kind of evolution and that tension, both building and sometimes breaking down, depending on the reception at home. But I have to say that we had students, from a British point of view, we had students queuing to go. It was a way of sending people into another community, a trusted community, in every sense, to meet many, many different people, many different teachers, many different approaches. And more than anything, one of the things that I came away with that from was learning about the United States as a really distinctive set of states. That was really important to me. But the other was learning about the history of American urbanism, which we were never taught. We were never really taught, other than Alexandria was connected. Washington, D.C. was connected to kind of French layout traditions. But we didn't really understand the makeup of the American city. We knew it, as I say, objectively, but not for real, and not how it worked. So there was some really big challenges there, but actually some great learning there, I think. So that was one of the really challenging ones, I think.
Yeah, I think that the differential between cultural expectations and protocols of evaluation, that was constantly negotiated. Every new partner school that joined us, it was a fascinating discussion among the faculty. Oh, so you typically do it this way, or would you be grading this way? And of course, grades are different. So we have our own system. Every school had its system. And a couple of quirks about how that worked. So these students were never actually enrolled at Virginia Tech. That's also an interesting thing to remember. And so in that sense, it was, how would we say in Washington, it was off book. It was sort of the WAAC was running this, and so the fees were paid to the WAAC. The students were never actually enrolled. So that had, on the one hand, the benefit of you didn't have to go through that larger bureaucracy, and it meant that we sort of were really in control of the fees, went directly back to paying adjuncts and to sort of supporting things. But as I've learned as an administrator, that's really not the way a large university would like you to run. And so we'll get later to the great reckoning that happened when the upper administration changed. As long as we had the support of our dean, who then became a university president, our university president, Charles Steger, we sort of had this institutional commitment to the fact that this was of value. And so my predecessor ran it sort of in his own way. But that sense that they were not always enrolled in Virginia Tech meant that we would evaluate them and we would grade together, which is really fascinating. I've taken it for granted that studio faculty sit around a table and say, let's look at how all the students did and let's weigh in so we make sure that our expectations are balanced. Some of the faculty didn't like that because they wanted that to be their job. But then faculty like Anne or like Julio from Chile or Ulrika from the Bauhaus would go back and translate those grades into their own system, or whoever the liaison was back at the program. And that was really always an interesting challenge. But in the end, it raised all these questions of what is learning? And I'd say we were constantly talking about these questions. So the fact that it was never entirely solved was in one sense a very productive pedagogical experiment, because it sort of raised these questions of what is an architectural education cross-culturally, and eventually, which we'll sort of get to what the new model and why I think the WAAC, despite all the disruption that we suffered, still has international as its brand, which has to do with why you want to come and learn how to practice a profession in a different culture. What is the value of that?
I mean, we should say it's 46 years old, and for any program to last for 46 years with a very informal start is an achievement. I mean, it's had its ups and downs, as we said. I think the other thing which I think for people coming from overseas, there were two other really key elements. One, that everybody, faculty and students, came in on a J1 visa, which I don't know what the equivalent is now, or whether it still even exists. But the great thing about that was that students could work a limited number of hours, and so could faculty. But the other thing was that we had next to the centre, or very close to the centre, the Virginia Tech had purchased accommodation. So there were two things, particularly when you're talking to parents or others, where you were also living in a community that was welcoming. So your colleagues, whether they were faculty or graduate students, were your neighbours. So there were two sort of social dynamics. One, there were films shown in the accommodation, and there were parties held in the accommodation, and then there was the academic side, and those two things meant that there was always that sense of safety, security, if you like, and belonging. But I think also that students could find not only the experience of learning, but the experience of learning and working. And some of them, we did have students who used to work in the shopping mall, dressing up as dinosaurs and cuddly bears and kind of giving out leaflets. That was one kind of job. And then there was the other kind, which was the professional experience of working in an architect's office. But all the students were doing those two things. So there was a very strong kind of professional approach to that. But I think one of the things, and we might want to expand on it, because Susan and I talked about it briefly, was that, and this is pedagogic, this is about learning. In the WAAC, you develop your own brief. Now, for us in Britain, we hadn't really taught the students, maybe rightly or wrongly, to do that. And students, quite rightly, in my view, will often find the path of least resistance, shall we say. So they will often design something to make it easy. And if they've set the brief, they can also move the brief. So there was a kind of that sort of individual, I will design this in this way and do this, was one of the challenges, rather than saying, you're going to design a law courts because they're complicated. So, and your learning outcomes would be different. So that was one of the big challenges, and I believe you still do that process.
We do somewhat. So, now that I'm director, and I used to say when I was faculty, I'd say, if I were in charge, most dangerous sentence ever, if I were in charge. And so then you find yourself in charge and you realize now is your chance to understand why things were done the way they were and how to correct. So that, and in architecture school and in design schools, frequently the way a semester works is there's a design project, which is a fictional model of something in the real world. Fictional being you're in the sandbox. So you can say, we're going to design, we have a studio this year that's designing embassies. So the embassy comes with a very specific program, and you can size it. Embassy for a small country, 25,000 square feet, has certain program requirements that students have to learn. But in that studio, each student can choose their own country. So we give them a lot of choice, and then they can choose what the emphasis is. Back in the real Wild West days, the students really just came and self-proposed projects. That created a really interesting burden on the faculty to sort of coach them. So we see ourselves as a coaching staff. But the reason we did it had to do with, I would argue, is the DNA of Virginia Tech's architecture pedagogy, which is equal measures of freedom and responsibility. And that applies to the faculty, what we choose to teach, and applies to the students setting the agenda for their own education. And that tracks back to President Steger, Charles Steger's sort of founding words about the College of Architecture. And when I became director, I reread some of his old typewritten documents, which was really fascinating. And he talked about creating an environment where students can fail in a safe way, where students can be encouraged to risk, and that students should be told that they are the leaders of their own education, and that our job as faculty is their resources. So that was always somewhat implicit at the WAAC. What could look like complete chaos from the outside actually had this fundamental pedagogical grounding. I found that as a director, it's helpful for me to be quite explicit about that to students. To the point when I'm recruiting graduate students, I'll say, you have to understand the WAAC isn't for everybody. If you thrive in an environment where you're given explicitly clear instructions and a rubric for how you'll be evaluated, go somewhere else. If you've been in that environment and you've been itching to set your own agenda and to see what you're capable of, come with us. And that our role is to help you become the design professional you want to become. So I've learned to make that more explicit. I've also learned not to be quite so Wild West about it, because actually the risk, and one of the things that got the WAAC into its vulnerable position right before I took over, was not reading the changing situation around us, the changes to higher education that we've talked about, the sort of, at least in the US, a shift to a more business model, an enterprise model, a model that demands evidence of success, a model that says we are pragmatists and we're preparing students for the job market. Because we're a professional program, we do have to do that. But we also believe that this is part of a liberal education. And so I began to sort of figure out, well, what are our success metrics? And how do I defend the consortium, for example, when it became clear that changes to the upper administration were about to undo the entire program? One of the metrics was how many of those study-away students that came from UNAM or Argentina or Chile or wherever, how many of them came back to Virginia Tech for graduate school? Because that's a direct, like, this is what they did here, this is what the consortium program was. How is that returned in tuition paid to Virginia Tech? Because now they're Virginia Tech students. And so it was an incredibly effective recruiting strategy for graduate programs. So you might say, well, why would they come back for graduate school? Well, back to what is the profession of architecture. If you want to practice architecture in the US and get a US license, you pretty much need a US professional degree, and that's often going to be a graduate degree. You can be qualified to practice in your own country, but professional controls, country to country being what they are, and in this case, state to state. Anne's comment that every state in the US is kind of its own mini nation also does apply with licensure. And so students would come back to the WAAC to get their US license. They would then come under a different visa. They could then do their practical training, many of them in years past. I don't need to tell this audience the past few years that has changed radically, and we're in a completely different environment again. But they would be able to work in the US, and some stayed, some would go back to their countries armed with 3 wonderful years of internship, of practice, and then go back to their countries. And so that pipeline was hugely important for us. And so there were ways to make success metrics. And I think the conversation, our panel before, was how do you assert the value of student mobility, of international education, of international diversity, intercultural programs, and sort of looking at some of those metrics, I think is really, really useful, because that means something to a university.
I mean, I was reflecting on our conversations yesterday, throughout the day, and some of the things that are happening now. and just thinking through whether, if you were trying to start a centre in any field actually today, would you be able to do what the Washington Alexandria Centre did? And my sad conclusion, I think, is it would be much, much more difficult. Yeah. Not just in the US, actually. I think it would be much more difficult anywhere, because I think that sense that you could, if you like, develop a set of conditions for something to happen with a core. In this case, architecture is a subject. And I was talking to Joe last night about IAFOR for the same reason. The conditions that you set up that allow possibility, creativity, innovation, the window to do that is much, much, much tighter. And I think there's a real lesson somewhere in here for what we tighten and prescribe and what we don't, or what we allow to evolve. And AI has really pushed that, I think, to an extreme, and we heard it yesterday. And talking about the community side of that, we need to really sharpen our act, probably across the world, in terms of some of those thoughts. So it's a kind of sad, but I think realistic thought that actually, how would we open up that opportunity in a different way? And I don't know if you want to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that you came across and what happened.
Yeah, the what happened was sort of like we're pitching a second season of a Netflix series, right? We're sort of setting up how wonderful it was in the Wild Wild West under a supportive leadership. And when that changes, everything changes. And so there were a couple of things, teaser, or sort of spoiler alert, we're a sort of different animal now, but I'll get to how we've put things back together. And the reason I became director was basically it was a time of crisis. That's been the phrase we've heard yesterday. And it was a time of crisis within Virginia Tech for a variety of reasons. Again, large changeover. And I'm not going to talk too much about the leadership, but we at the time looked like we were kind of running a rogue program, but it was also arguably quite successful. We had by then, this being it had been around for 30 plus years, we had a loyal pool of alumni from our own program who tended to stay in the DC area. So we have an incredible network here. And that unique pool of alumni included consortium students who were loyal to the WAAC for giving them this chance to be an architect in America. And a lot of our own alumni, graduate students who never took a class in Blacksburg but did their entire degree program with us, also loyal to us. So we had quite a powerful alumni base who supported what we did. The upper administration sort of saw that this was a fee-based program and then began to inquire into the fee structure. And that's when I came in as director and realized that the sort of casualness of the way it had been run before was a really dangerous vulnerability. Different programs were paying different fees depending on when they came in. There had not been an index that the fees could be tied to help them be raised with justification. So you can pick any index. It could have been inflation, which in the case, if we had set that up in 1991 or so, would have been tracking a certain way, so the fees would have gone up with inflation. The other metric, and the one I've chosen to use for our new way of running this, is tying it to in-state tuition increases. And so that has to do with one of our workarounds we ultimately developed. And so what happened was they wanted to charge all of these study-away students the equivalent of out-of-state tuition to come study at Virginia Tech. And that broke the entire program. None of our European partners, none of our Latin American partners, and none of our domestic partners were going to do that because it's not plausible in their scenarios, right? Americans already complain about the cost of higher education, and compared to what the cultural expectations are elsewhere, that was not going to happen. Fortunately, Cal Poly at San Luis Obispo had been with us the entire time, and someone at Cal Poly told me, well, you should join the National Student Exchange. And that's how I learned about the National Student Exchange. And so we have since joined the National Student Exchange. Only the WAAC. Again, I guess I'm modeling the rogue behavior of my predecessor just a little bit. I couldn't get the whole university to do it, so I just did it. And that's fine. And so that opened us up to, first of all, the hundreds of schools in the National Student Exchange, but more important for us, about 35 architecture and landscape architecture programs, some of which had been our old consortium members. Cal Poly, Louisiana State, Mississippi State, and Texas A&M were all in the National Student Exchange. And so the other trick was finding a way around the tuition requirement. And so I found, with the help of some, again, this is back to not being, I wouldn't say subversive, but when you believe in a program, you have to be clever and resourceful and not take no for an answer. So the way we solve that problem is our students come in through the Office of Continuing and Professional Education, and they pay a fee equivalent to in-state tuition, which is the terms the National Student Exchange. All students move between campuses, either paying the host or the home, in-state tuition. And so this gives us an index for increases or decreases, should they ever happen. I've never seen that happen, but potentially that would happen. And that still gives us a portal for the students to come in. We did our first test of whether that would work with an international school a few years ago with Kyushu University in Japan. And so we don't have any Kyushu students this year, but we have had several come in. And back to my original metric for success, one of them came back for graduate school. So we are sort of rebuilding, but in a kind of legitimate, more solidly grounded way, the consortium model. The in-state tuition number is still out of reach for many of our European and Latin American partners, but I stay in touch with all of them. And so there's sort of the sense that if there's ever the moment or the situation for you to come back in, we have a path. The door is a side door, but it's an official door, and it's open. And the other legacy of the consortium, well, first of all, is that Anne immediately felt comfortable reaching out to me for this, which I love, but that we continue to work with some of those partners in other ways and in other research projects. And so the lesson I learned from that was, first of all, yes, if you believe in something, you have to be clever. If it's unconventional, you have to find ways to make the unconventionality of it fit into the normative operation of the university, and also be constantly aware of what the conversation is so that you can make sure you're aligned with the values. Right now, Virginia Tech's interested in global distinction. They are sort of permeating the idea of experiential learning. They are sort of encouraging every student, in at least for a semester, to have an international experience. And so when I talk to my dean and the upper administration, I sort of emphasize those things because we've been doing those things all along. We're doing them differently. But I would say one of the legacies of that internationalism is we have an extremely international graduate population. And part of that is because we're here in Washington, and who doesn't want to come to this area, I should say. And you can feel very comfortable in an extremely diverse city like Washington. But I think it's also part of our brand, and continuing to convey that we are international, interdisciplinary, that's got a little bit of an asterisk, and still individually focused, means that feeds on itself. And so one of the things that's happened this spring, which is just a little bit of an anecdote, and I missed it yesterday, is student-led weekly celebrations of the various New Year's and spring celebrations of all the cultures that are represented at the WAAC. So every Thursday in our library, our librarian, who is from China, we had Chinese New Year, we had Nowruz, we celebrated Easter, and I think yesterday was Bengali New Year, and I'm sorry I missed it. And it's celebrated with food and sort of arts and crafts and sort of student community. That's our other word here. And letting students take the lead for that is sort of, again, deeply ingrained in the WAAC tradition. So yeah, that's sort of the crisis, the journey of the hero. Like we had our crisis and we sort of came out and we're putting things back together again.
But I think if we then expanded the idea, you talked yesterday about being the kind of moon, the satellite.
Right.
working in satellites is, I think, a really interesting model for kind of saying, can the satellites feed the center in that sense? So the thing that was extraordinary, it's an extraordinary and very long experiment that keeps going. But I think one of the things I think personally, higher education is in a really interesting and dynamic time, but also there is enough financial crisis, never mind anything else around the world. I know very few places that are looking to expand their budgets at the moment for higher education, particularly in the last probably 2 months, should we say. And I think that's really impacting on how people take risks. And the one thing I'd say now, and I raised it mischievously yesterday, was, why do we teach what we already know? And that kind of question, which is it is a mischievous question, but it's actually a really important question. And we heard it in AI, and we heard it in the kind of community engagement piece yesterday. And you kind of say, well, can a satellite like this be a pilot study in a way, I think, for experimentation? And Joe and I often talk about IAFOR like that it's a growing experiment, and we will try things like this, and then and some of them will work, and some of them, and we welcome, I think, the feedback. And somebody said that was fantastic, that was awful, we won't do that again. But I think that idea of moving away from the kind of the weight of the campus or the weight of an institution in order to do something that's quite dynamic. How far that can go and how far we could ever think about the distributed institution internationally, I think is a big question for higher education at the moment. What needs to be together? Where do we need to be face-to-face and trust and build trust? But the interesting thing, I think, about Washington Alexandria Center over many, many years is I am still in touch with every student that came out here. So I probably brought 50 or 60. They are still some of the most adventurous, experimental students. They haven't all become successful architects. They do all sorts of things. But boy, they are people in the world who now know what it is they do and have the confidence to take on new challenges. And I think, as I say, irrespective of your subject, there is something about that kind of experimental moment. And students would say, and I taught here, I also taught in Montana for a while, which felt like an outpost in every sense of the word. But students would just kind of go, I'm just taking a car from coast to coast. I'll be back in 2 weeks. And I say, you've got a project to do. But they did it, and they did it because it was part of the experience. It was a lived experience. It wasn't just, you're here to study these courses and to do this thing and to, you're living in a culture, and you imbibe of all of it, not just the academic part. And I think that sense, that's why I mentioned the housing and neighborliness. And when I lived in Montana, remember to sweep the snow off the pavement or you get fined. It was those kind of moments that were really important as a part of being in a community and understanding something different. Conscious of time, is there anything you wanted to particularly talk about in terms of the future of the WAAC?
Yeah, I think, so where are we now after all of this? One, I've been director now for 10 years. I'm sort of aware of this legacy and sort of that I'm the steward of this program, starting to look at succession questions, like what does happen next. 46 years is a long time, but a lot of it was I'm only the third director of the program, is one way to think about it. And so that's quite a lot of stability in, if you're a sci-fi fan, I often call the WAAC an off-world colony, with all of the narratives that go with that. And so where we are now is smaller physically and population-wise than we were at our peak. We have had other degree programs, so we have grown and shrunk over the years for a variety of reasons. At the moment, we have favorable administration in the college and in the school, but still some headwinds because of other priorities, headwinds in the upper administration. But we are optimistic about now expanding back. We'd like to bring up landscape architecture again. So we're smaller, but we're still with the National Student Exchange, and we still, despite the macro political global issues, we'll see what our incoming graduate population is in terms of international students. It is, that's a whole other panel is to talk about that problem. And I think the new faculty, we've had a demographic turnover in some of the long-term faculty. They're starting to retire. And so this is a period of real change, which I'm sort of acutely aware of, making sure that the junior faculty that come in sort of learn, like, why are you chose to be here. You chose to actually come to a place that's not a big campus with all the resources you're accustomed to. And so in that sense, the WAAC self-selects people who want to be in an environment that allows experimentation and that allows that freedom and responsibility equation. And to me, that's my challenge, is to continue to make sure that everybody in the building understands you have an idea and we'll say yes, right? And you see it through. And that's something, that ability to be a kayak instead of a big ocean liner, so you might get swamped, but you can also move really quickly. And you also know you're relying on yourself to do it. So there's strength in that, and there's also a vulnerability. Those of you who are coming this afternoon, you'll see, amidst all of the construction, there is pinned up on the wall a map of the world and a statement by our students. Because when we lost the consortium and were under threat, our students themselves put out a manifesto about the value of community and international education. And they printed it out, these being architecture students. It's a beautiful map, a map of the world, and then there's a box of pins. And for the last 10 years, every student comes and they put a pin in where they're from. And so that map is prickly, and it's prickly in certain spots, but it also tells you, and they call this, it's called WAAC World. And so WAAC World sort of gives you that picture, and it's a constant reminder that came from our students of the value of community and international education. So if you're coming this afternoon, that'll be a highlight of, it's always a highlight for me to show that.
Good. Lots of you have listened to us talking.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask any questions? So this is a kind of open, this is an open conversation. Yeah. It's not a conversation just between Susan and I. We can do that. There's a man with his hand up already, I can see.
Thank you so much for this understanding of what your program does. Let me ask you a question, though. With the current climate, as you stated, when it comes to international students, how are you being able to navigate through all of the political atmosphere? I want to use another word, but of all of the political...
We're being recorded.
Yes, that's why I said I wanted to use another word. But the political nonsense that's going on.
You know, it's student by student. And it's, you know, like I said, we're high touch. In addition to my duties as director, I'm also the de facto chair of our graduate program for the Master of Architecture. So I and one of my junior colleagues review all of the applicants. And reaching out, you know, listening to their concerns. The students from the countries that are not going to be able to come in, amazingly, they're still applying, which to me is an incredible sign of optimism. But also, they'll, you know, when I tell them, you know, you can defer to next year, right? We'll admit you can defer to next year, and sort of admitting that we really have no control over that. We do have a limited number of graduate assistantships, and I will be honest, we prioritize international students, because what that does is we give up half assistantships that'll set their tuition to equal to in-state tuition. And then if I do that, I can help a lot of students as opposed to just a few with full tuition waivers. So it's back to my comment in our panel discussion yesterday. One of the big challenges is knowing what to say yes to and what to say no to. We have a lot of students. Currently, we had strong sort of, a sort of portal open to Iran. We've always had a lot of Iranian students, and we have some currently who are, of course, now in just a state of high anxiety. And so there's a lot of listening. But the impact on declining graduate enrollments is something that's a concern, I think, across the U.S., and we're all feeling the hit. It's also, if I could rant and rave for a bit, really counterproductive. Like, also their work, their OPT is all being held up. Like, we've all just invested American taxpayer dollars and efforts by public employees to educate international students. And in that act of cultural diplomacy, to be working one-on-one, the fact that they still want to come is amazing, but it's a challenge.
Thank you. Yeah. One more question? I was going to say, Donald.
Sure, thank you. And it's fascinating, and I think there are lots of things that we could talk about in terms of lessons learned, from just an administrative standpoint. But I guess the real question, though, in terms of where you are now, it seems to me that there would be extraordinary fundraising opportunities around scholarships.
Yes.
Because if you do, in fact, have a whole network of highly successful professionals, you would think that they would want to give back to actually support the international students like them who are coming in.
Right, so we, first of all, architects don't make that much money. That's our other lesson. But even so, we do have an advisory board of our own, and I do my own fundraising. And we do have scholarship money. We haven't hit the big money yet, because advancement is its own job. And our advancement team with the college and with the school are focused on the really big money. But I stay in close contact with them, first of all, so that I'm not at cross purposes. But that's our ambition, is to actually raise the bigger money to really help with that. But we do have some.
I would just say that you'd be surprised where there's money. And a lot of money is tied up in the states.
Yeah.
And where you should be focused right now is in the state money.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the tip.
Yes. Pro tip.
We're around for a bit longer, and Donald and I are doing something a bit later with Joe on this stage. But I just want to say a massive thank you to Susan. It's very nice to see you after 29 years. And if anybody wants to ask any more questions, do come and ask us. I'm sure we'd be delighted to do that. So,
and I will see you all, or some of you in Alexandria. If you can, we'll be on a construction site. Dress appropriately, closed-toed shoes if you brought them. If not, we're not going to throw you out. But I will be there ahead of you. I'll not be traveling with you. So I will see the group of you later this afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for this interview session. And how many of you are going to the tour later?